Please welcome Crystal Hollis, who is speaking on England's historic graffiti, Voices Preserved in Stone. Crystal Hollis, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out today and coming back after lunch this afternoon. Just waiting for the PowerPoint to go up. Did I break it? No, I didn't break it. Yay! Oh, good. I like interactive audiences. This is good. Hello, everybody. I'm Crystal. A little bit about me first, before I tell you about graffiti and its role in medieval and early modern culture. So I've been doing this about 7 years now. When people ask me what I do, I've gotten to the point where I go, I stare at walls professionally. Which is true, and it's quite fun. So I've been doing this about 7 years. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Exeter, so I'm finally getting a bit more formal about it. My most notable work is right here in this chapel, the St. Joan of Arc Chapel in Milwaukee, which is about an hour from where I live in Chicago, and it's got 12 inscriptions that shouldn't have existed, but do. You can read about that later online if you want. So, really quick, what is graffiti? When you look at this image, there's just a lot going on. And hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll be able to kind of parse little bits out of it on your own. So this is a good example of graffiti, an absolute mess, frankly. So typically when we hear the word graffiti today, we think it's bad, it's vandalism, it's damaging something, it's prohibited, all these negative connotations. But what we can tell is in the early modern and medieval era, graffiti wasn't really a thing. There's actually not even a word for it until the 19th century. We just get people writing on walls and people drawing things on walls. So the kind of general research definition of graffiti is anything that appears in a building that's inscripted or painted or drawn on with pencil that isn't part of the original design aesthetic or any planned design aesthetic, but it's there. So that's kind of a long definition, but that's the working definition right now. So hopefully by the end of this talk, we're going to cover just a few bits of graffiti that you're likely to find if you go out to seek some yourself. There's plenty of places in and around London for you to do it. Now, I know we just had a brilliant talk by Brian on apotropaic stuff. I'm going to add just a tiny bit onto it with graffiti. So in this image, I have 3 different images of apotropaic graffiti from 3 different sites. You'll notice that 2 are circular. You have the very standard, famous hex foil compass drawn right over here on the right-hand side. That's usually when people hear medieval graffiti, what they tend to think of now. It's just become so famous. And it does show up literally everywhere when we are surveying. We find it in churches, houses, castles, barns, pubs, anywhere that there's a wall, we usually find these. In the center there is a kind of weird variation on that theme, which is another secular compass-drawn theme. Many people will look at it and say, oh, that's a consecration cross. And normally I'd say they were right, except consecration crosses are this big, normally, and that one's this big. But it still serves a similar function, and I'll tell you that function in just a second. On the far side, you can see all of the little stars near each other. Those we tend to call pentangles. And all of these follow a very similar tradition or idea. And they operate on the premise that demons are very stupid. So if you look at these, you'll see that none of them have lines that particularly come to an end, and there's no particular exit out of them. So if you were to take your finger and trace around in that circle and try to find a way out, it's impossible. Same with the star, and same with that little pseudo, kind of, frankly, poorly done mini consecration cross in the center. There's no way out. So the idea is that the demon or the bad spirit or whatever it is we're calling it this time, some people say it's witches, it's usually not witches, is they'll see it and they'll start to follow it. And they'll either get very confused and therefore unable to follow you in or out of wherever you're going, In some lines of research, they think that it traps that entity there. And in others, they think that particularly anything with a circle will open a portal and zap it away where it can't bother you anymore. As I said, we find them literally everywhere, and I wanted to provide you guys with one that you're not likely to see on your own. This is an example from Bradford and Avon Barn in Wiltshire. It is open, and there's loads of stuff in there. If you get the chance to go, please do. I was working with the Wiltshire Medieval Graffiti Survey a couple of months ago, and we recorded a bunch of stuff going on in there. We found loads of apotropaic symbols all over the sides of the barn itself, loads in the entryways, even more in the entryways. And then this was a fun one to get. Up in the window. And we're not allowed to use ladders to climb, so with the cunning use of selfie sticks, and I think we put a flashlight, a little torch up on a broom pole, and each of us kind of did this sort of thing for about 10 minutes to get that photograph. And we actually found some inside the recesses of the windows and then surrounding the windows as well. It makes sense to have protective stuff in your home. It makes sense to have protective stuff in a church. But a lot of people ask me, why barns? Frankly, it's just because that's where your food is. It's where your food is, and it's where food for the stock is. This is for a tithe barn. So they would have been bringing in crops from all over the place and storing them there for winter. So you would want that to stay fresh and not have anything come into contact with it that would make it spoil or go off, because you need to eat throughout the winter. The final apotropaic mark that I want to talk about is a game board. Now, if you notice this photo, you look very, very closely, you notice that the game board is on a vertical surface. Usually I get told, oh, it's a game board, you play it. And that is true in some cases. There's definitely game boards in choir stalls that were there to be played. And a few in, a few in the cloisters, that's the word. I was like, it's not cloisters, it's cloisters. A few in the cloisters as well, on the benches, you do get them. Like I've seen a little checkerboard in Salisbury's, that's a quite famous one. But this one's vertical, it's not playable. If you put any pieces on, it will fall off. It's just not doable. This is a tradition that we see on the continent, and it does show up in the kind of Scandinavian and Nordic areas as well. There's a really, really good one in Finland, in Turku Castle. It's about that big, and it's right near a window. This is another protective thing. They either show up as mazes, where, again, it's very obvious. It's to confuse and trap and move things away. But why a game like Merrill's or Fox and Geese, something similar to this? The idea when you play these games, if you look at this example, there's a lot of little dots in the center. And the whole idea is movement. So you want to move bad things either into the center where they're neutralized, or out and away where they can't bother you, depending on which kind of theory you are following. The second most popular and famous kind of graffiti is ship graffiti. There are entire Tumblr accounts dedicated to ship graffiti, Twitter accounts, Instagram accounts. Everybody loves ship graffiti. They're really fun. And the maritime community has done an amazing job of being able to look at most ship graffiti and give you, within 100 to 50 years, when it should be dating from. But then we get ones like this, which are a pretty simple ship kind of shape. And what this is, in my context, because I focus on churches, is usually a votive image. And votive images are usually something that you use to pray. So, I'm praying for safe passage, or it's something to show devotion. A lot of times when we are looking at ships, we do get them in areas of the church that were previously dedicated to St. Nicholas, patron saint of sailors. The other kind of votive graffiti we get is hands and feet. Canterbury Cloisters has loads of hands and feet all over the walls. And on the benches, these 2 feet are from a parish church on a bench. And you will also find these inside buildings, outside buildings. You'll find them all over the place. You'll occasionally get them on roofs in lead, but they're not votive. They're literally just somebody being like, yeah, I did this. Woohoo. So typically when you're looking at votive body parts, you are getting somebody praying to cure an ailment, or you're getting somebody, again, marking some sort of journey. The most famous instance of votive images that we have is from Exeter Cathedral, when they found this whole cache of wax images, and it was hands and eyes and lips and feet, and there was a horse head and an entire woman at one point that had been deposited as a kind of pray for me, heal this, etc. In addition to being a place of worship and a place where you're interacting with that kind of spiritual realm, the saints and the demons and all that, churches and medieval buildings were places of work. And that's what I'm showing here. We've got a merchant's mark all the way on this side. It looks like a 4, a little fancy 4. these were kind of the logos of the day. So if you were donating a lot of money to a church or having a monument built, you would want your merchant's mark on it so people could, it's displaying your wealth, really is what it is. And you also would kind of mark out, if you're selling things in your own town, you'd mark out, hey, so-and-so's here. Now, the interesting thing about merchant's marks is we find them in what we call a formal context as well, which means that they show up on commissioned monuments. So if you go to St. Olave, Hart Street, for example, you can see a beautiful one in a brass monument up on the walls, up near the chancel. And you will find them sometimes carved out in stone as well, very formally. It was commissioned. And you'll find them near coats of arms. So it's very much a status symbol. It's all about money. The other two are Mason's marks. Now, Mason's marks are an hour-long talk in itself because there's so many different kinds, and they grow and they change over time. The ones that you have here are very simple. So there's banker's marks, mason's marks, foreman's marks, and a couple of the marks lurking around there as well, and also maker's marks for monuments that you'll find too. And typically what these symbols mean, if you see them in the wild, is somebody was either signing off on the quality of work, somebody wanted to get paid, and somebody was doing the paying. It's typically what those things mean. This is a really rare example of architectural graffiti. So if we're going on the whole theme of work and masons, what better to follow it up with than this lovely rose window from Leighton Buzzard. Architectural graffiti is incredibly rare. If you ever see it, let me know. I'm always looking for it. Usually you're lucky to get kind of a line with a couple of arcs that bisect it. And you're like, yeah, that's a rough outline of a something, but I'm not sure what. But sometimes you get really lucky and you get stuff like this. You get whole windows. I've got, from one priory, I have the plan for poppy heads for the benches carved out on another piece of wood. So you will get full designs sometimes. But the fun thing is when you look around, the designs don't always match what's there, and you look around, you're like, where is that? Back in the day, it was very popular for people to travel and try and get work. So it's very likely that some of the designs that we have, I know I've got a couple of roof designs that are likely people stopping through, going, hello, would you like a new roof? This is what I can do. And then carrying on if it wasn't built. Also, you have to remember, window designs and roofs and windows fall in and fall down and get redone all the time. Certain bishops or priors will get tired of one way that it looks and want to catch up with whatever's fashionable and tear it down. So it's always hard to say if some of these designs existed and are gone, or if these designs never existed at all. But they are really rare and they're really beautiful to see. So obviously, buildings were places where people were, and they were doing people-y things, and they were living their lives just like we do. And so a lot of graffiti that we actually find is commemorative in nature. It's not all about demons and scary things and money and selling, and a lot of it's just people doing everyday normal things. And this is a mummer's mask, and there's two of them in this particular church on the outside, and they look like this weird giraffe thing. There's a few over in Essex. They do show up, and you get these like little, commemorating a festival or something that was going on. Churchyards were very lively places. There were cockfights, there were beer festivals, there were theatrical productions, all these things going on all the time. And so people were just drawing out and kind of marking the event. We also get instances like this. This is in a bell ringing tower, and somebody was very kind and yet unkind at the same time to go over all of these inscriptions with a Sharpie. Don't do that, please. It's great for photographic purposes. You guys can probably read most of that, but from my standpoint, it's a nightmare. So this entire bell ringer's tower looks just like this, just all four walls just covered. And it's like, oh, thanks, but no thanks. So most of the names here are going to be obviously tied to the church and tied to people who were doing the bell ringing. That's who would have had access to these places. As you can see, it's mostly 18th century. This is from a building here in London, and a lot of the dates we're seeing are consistent with, renovations and stuff were being done in that building. So you've got, names and dates and just people kind of marking, yeah, I was here. Sometimes in bell ringers' towers, you'll get them actually writing out like the peal of bells That's really fun. Southwark Cathedral has a few different examples of that, and they'll be in chalk or pencil, and you can see kind of all the different songs that they would play. If you find a bell ringer, they'll tell you what the melody was, and it's really, really neat to be able to connect it all like that. Going back to people just recording the things that they saw, you will also note a very teeny tiny gallows up there. I'm in the process of digging through and seeing if there was a gallows near this site, if there was one that was visible from this church tower. It hasn't yielded too much yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were executions not too far away, because this was in the city of London, and people were just being like, oh yeah, I did this today. Finalizing kind of our little commemoration jaunt. If you look at this one, it's gorgeous. It's got those hex foils, those daisy wheels, but they're not protective this time. We're not warding off demons. They're there to be pretty. We've got 2 initials, WS, and the date 1703. This is sadly the only surviving piece of graffiti in this one building, and it's in an area that's been converted to the toilets. So it's really awkward walking in, because now it's an office block as well. So you walk in and you're like, hello, can I see your toilet, please? And everyone's like, why? Look, there's graffiti in it. I've got to look at it. So this is a fairly famous one. It's from the lovely folks at St. Clement, East Cheap. If you ask really, really nicely, they will let you have a look at it. It literally is in the toilet. It's very awkward. But it is the only one that we have. And you'll notice that at the top, it's got this little flag post and a little tiny flag. When you're finding things like this, it's usually commemorating the death of somebody. Somebody probably died, and this was an informal memorial to them. Usually you will find these looking more like little houses with either a fleur-de-lis at the top or a flag, sometimes a cross. Occasionally you'll get weird little rectangular boxes, and sometimes you'll just get lists of initials and dates underneath. And a lot of times that surname initial is the same, and then you can kind of get a feeling that, yeah, something was probably going on there. In at least one instance, they've been able to trace groupings of this kind of commemorative graffiti to an instance of plague and a family losing, I think, all of the children all at once. So they can be quite tragic, but also yield a wealth of information for the researcher. And of course, people. People record people. People love to take photographs of people and paint people. We know this from looking at artworks all throughout time. This is a very famous one, and everybody calls her a witch. I'm not convinced she's a witch, because that's also very similar to Puritan clothing, so this could be a very just badly done cartoon. It is an area that, okay, usually I never fall back on the bored children thing, because it's usually almost never bored children, but this wasn't an area of school, so it could have been bored children, because above it, it's cut off in this photograph, but if anybody's interested, email me, I'll send you the other one. There's a multiplication tables above it, so that could be the culprit is children. So people, they record people as well, and sometimes you are lucky enough to get a really good story, like this one. If anyone is familiar with Simnel cakes, this is supposedly the origin of the Simnel cake. It's Simon and Nellie there. She's got him by the ear and a spoon in the other hand, because they're arguing, and I think she's winning in this depiction. And the basic story is they were figuring out what to do with this food. He wanted to boil it into a pudding. She wanted to bake it into a cake. Somehow violence broke out. And they compromised in the end, and boom, Simnel cake, Simon, Nellie, Sim, Nell, yeah. And that's where it came from. And this is a beautiful carving of it. And so sometimes those little folk legends do make their way onto the walls. Can we guarantee that that's what this is showing? No, but it has definitely become part of the folklore of this church. And it's become very, very mixed in with the traditions and the stories of that church. We've also got examples of people in castles. This is part of the keep in Norwich Castle. You'll notice that she's lovely. She's got this great wimple, and then she's got her face, and it's very yellowed and brown. That's from people touching it. She's about this high up on the wall, which means she is visible. Graffiti wasn't made to be hidden away. It's usually in places people can see it quite easily. And she's just kind of hanging out in the keep. Now, the fun thing about castles and keeps is that some people were there for a very long time. and had not much to do. And so you get beautiful kind of carved out reliefs of these people and images and things to do with names and heraldic crests. If anybody's been to the Tower of London, there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on, just people that were sitting there trapped with nothing else to do, and they made these beautiful pieces of artwork. It's now the chapel area of Norwich Castle. And when you look at it, you do have a couple of heraldic shields up there. You do have, it looks like somebody's like holding a child almost. You've got some buildings going on in there. Another place to look at if you're interested in like prison graffiti and that sort of thing from this time period, go to the Museum of London. They've got that cell down on the lower floor. There's loads of stuff going on in there as well. But you get a lot of stories and a lot of like little personal mementos in places like this. They're usually very fragile though. Despite the fact that they're very well carved, you'll see that these guys are all scraped up and dinged about. So they are pretty fragile and they don't always survive the way we'd like them to. But the best place to look for people, at least from where I'm standing, is once again going to be churches. Two of these are cathedrals, the Knight and that really weird looking. That guy over there all the way is a cartoon of a bishop, very poorly done. And then we've got somebody dancing in the center, and that's from a parish church. So you do tend to find these little cartoons of people. And you'll find, knights, you'll find, obviously little clergy members, merchants, all sorts of little people drawn out on the walls. You will find images of Christ. You'll find a crowned. There's people that a lot of times we think she's Mary. There'll be like a crowned, like beautiful princessy looking person. So you will find these people at the time. The really fun one, though, is animals. Everybody loves animals. They're really fun. They're impossible to date. It's impossible to really know what they mean. The hare, for example, he's gorgeous. He's from St. Albans, also really easy to get to if you want to go see. And he could mean one of a million things. Some people tie him to witchcraft. I often ask, was there anywhere that there was hare coursing nearby? And there's also, was there anybody that lived here that had the surname Hare? Because sometimes you get those little picture puzzles, those little rebuses, where people are, announcing their presence or their existence with little puzzles. The birds in particular are the really frustrating ones. Anyone who does anything with medieval stuff knows that birds are their own language, and each specific bird means a specific thing. And when you look at these birds, you can tell that the one is an eagle or a hawk or a falcon, maybe, but what's the other one? That could literally be any kind of bird, so we lose that meaning by not knowing what it's intended to be. Other animals seem to serve a heraldic purpose, like this lion, again from Norwich Castle. He looks almost exactly like a lion you would see in a shield. So do bear in mind when you see an animal, it really could have one of dozens of meanings. And just to show off, here's a swan, the only bird that I've ever found that you can tell what it is supposed to be. Also in St. Albans, really easy to see. You can also see he's yellowy brown from people touching it, with the subtext of the message being there, please don't touch the graffiti. Because when it gets like that, it can actually start to crumble and decay, and it gets much more difficult to record. But there's also kind of like weird, fantastical animals that appear in all of these churches and other buildings. These two are for Southwark Cathedral. They look very similar to what you would find in the margins of a medieval book. On the sides, it's usually called marginalia. And you've got something on the one side that looks a bit like a lion, and the other looks kind of like a dog, jackal, bird thing. And that's what we're leaving it at. So the area that these have been found in the cathedral is quite old, and it's very likely actually people like practicing for things. Or it could again be heraldic. This guy, though, I don't know what his purpose is, but he's huge. He's about that big by that big. He's a giant beast of Finching Field. And so one of the things that is important to remember about medieval and early modern people is that monsters and demons and ghosts and things like that were very, very real and very, very tangible. They made you sick, they killed your children, they made you miscarry, they made your cow sick, they killed all of your crops. They basically just caused problems wherever they went. So sometimes when you find these really ugly, horrifying looking beasts, it's somebody's interpretation of probably what one of those is. This one's a bit easier to see, and it's the demon at St. Mary Trustin in Suffolk. And my hypothesis on this one is that he's actually, he's obviously a demon. He's very, very clearly a demon. If you look at any medieval depictions in a doom painting of demons or in books of demons, that's pretty much your textbook demon. He's so finely executed, though, compared to the beast that we just saw, which looks very freehand. He's very well done, but he's very freehand. This guy's quite precise. And what he probably is setting outlines for a painting or a test drawing for a painting that would have gone on a chancel arch or somewhere on a wall nearby, probably a dome. There's not any of that painting left. There's a giant St. Christopher and a St. George and a couple other bits in St. Mary's. That's quite good, but nothing formal from a demon. That's probably what he is. So do be aware, if you see something that's excessively neat, it might be somebody practicing for something. So this is a fun one. I don't expect anybody to be able to read this because it's very old Latin. But the first bit... Ooh, can somebody? Yeah, that's the one. Yay, somebody knows it. He knows it. Okay, so this is what's... yeah, round of applause. So this is what's called a rebus puzzle. And that's great, because now I don't have to spend as much time explaining it. So it says the first word as well, and then in the middle there's this bit of music. And this is mentioned in Violet Pritchard's book. And for a long time, they couldn't figure out, like, what is this music bit about with this DY and this weird square and this YNE? Like, what is going on? And then somebody sat down and actually passed it out, and they figured out that the music staff is the do, re, mi version. And so when they looked at it, it was, well, fa, re, mi, la. The DY is for lady, and then the square is a dice, but back then it was called a cater. So it's catering. So then, as was just said, it's welfare, my Lady Catherine. So you do get little rebus puzzles like that. They're fairly rare, but I think that they're rare only because we've seen them in other guises and we haven't decoded them yet. So if you see weird collections like this, it may well be just a puzzle. And this actually occurs 3 times in the same church, once in full and 2 with just welfare, my lady. And they're all in different areas of the church as well, which is quite interesting. While we're on the subject of music, this is a small example from Gloucester Cathedral. Music's really, really rare. It's kind of like with architectural stuff. It's very fine lines. It's very easy to damage. We just discovered 2 new bits of music in Exeter Cathedral, and they are so damaged that I'm not sure we're going to be able to get the actual notes out of them, but we can see it's a staff, and there's like 1 or 2 notes, and then the rest is just so degraded. We can't quite get to it. But this is at the back of Gloucester Cathedral, and a lot of times when you come across music, it's on a processional route. So you can tell that it's there to remind people of what to sing next. A lot of them are antiphons, and some of them, again, are little, like mnemonic reminders of things. I hope you can all read this. It's in English, not Latin. But it says, Harry Cooper was sworn bell ringer in the year of our Lord, 1545. It's one of my favorite inscriptions of all time. I know some of you have been to my talks before, and I know you've seen this slide. It's going to be in here until the end of time, unless I find one better, because it's my favorite. We basically have a name and a date, and we know that this is Winchester Cathedral, and we have an activity he was doing, bell ringing. Those were usually recorded. So if somebody really wanted to, they could probably find something about this individual, or at least trace his family a little bit and learn a bit about him. You do get these kind of written out English inscriptions of people recording certain things that they've done, or certain kind of like kudos that they've gotten, or the things that are going on in the kind of village and parish. Of course, my favorite bit about this is if you look below it, you can see where he messed up the first time. That's hands down my favorite bit of that entire one. This is also a quite famous bit of graffiti, also in Latin. A lot of the general rules, it looks like weird squiggles. It's probably some form of Latin. This is at St. Mary the Virgin in Ashwell, and it is the kind of massive memorial for the Black Death that went through, and it gives us the date, it gives us roughly how many people died. It's hugely tragic, and it's actually kind of a moving piece when you go and see it. It's quite high up on a wall, and you can see it's been engraved quite deeply. So it was something that somebody, if not a group of people, were really trying to kind of like burn into the memory of this church in a way. And you do find other little Latin bits in all sorts of churches. Usually when we find Latin, the first thing we think is like, oh, only the wealthy could read this, only the rich had anything to do with Latin. The more we research medieval communities, the more we're finding that's not true. There were often what we call the textual community present in a lot of these places. So not everybody could read the Latin, But there might be a few people that could read it to the rest of the people and translate it. Some people could write and not read, vice versa, that sort of thing. Some people could only read and make out a few letters. And once you get to that point where English starts to become more mainstream in writing, you get where some people can read English and not Latin, and vice versa. So it's actually quite a complicated spectrum. But Latin is usually indicative that there's somebody there that can read it out loud to other people, because it's meant to be seen and it's meant to be kind of dispersed and shared amongst others. So most of the graffiti I've shown you, with the exception of the weird not which person, has been on stone. I just wanted to reinforce that wood is a good place to check for graffiti. This is a bit of reused furniture. It's in St. Bennet Paul's Wharf. I did a big survey there last year. I know it's reused because this picture's actually flipped upside down. Everything in this particular pew is upside down and kind of set in. It's been cut. You can actually see at the one join at the top, it's very faint, but one inscription's been cut in half. So it's not done once this piece was created. It predates the piece. This grouping here is definitely commemorative, and it's probably a family, and as it's all 1741, it was probably some sort of illness that killed them all. I would have to figure out, this is the fun part about wood and furniture, it travels around a lot, so I'd have to figure out the provenance of the pews, and then figure out who made them, and if I can source the wood or not from it, and then try and figure out where these individuals were from. And then, of course, finally, I want to encourage you to check in weird places. This is on the inside of a pew, so like if you're sitting and you look here, that's where it is. It's in a very weird spot. And it's, again, reused wood. It's definitely something commemorative. I can make out an initial. I can make out part of February. There on the side, it's been turned around. What is it actually? I will not know. But I still need to record it because technically it's part of the fabric. It's part of the graffiti kind of data for that building. So do always keep an eye out for that. So I'll leave you with a couple of graffiti finding tips. One, I already said don't touch it. I'll say it again, don't touch it. Don't do it. I will find you. Particularly alabaster monuments. I mean, they're beautiful, and when they're covered with graffiti, you do just want to do this. It looks really pretty, and a lot of people do, and I'm just like, please don't do that, particularly those softer stones. It will smudge everything over time. Like, one person doing this is fine. 2,000 people doing this, you've just ruined it. So don't touch it. If you want to photograph it, the easiest way to do is if this is your wall, you take your light and you rake it across. So the light goes kind of across it like this. You never shine it directly on it. You won't get very much out of it. Also, just kind of like be nice about it. If there's church wardens and vergers about, just, say hello and introduce yourself, because otherwise they will ask if you're okay. They will. In one cathedral, I had a verger walk by me 5 times. Just kind of very slowly doing that sort of thing. And he's like, Miss, are you all right? I was like, yes, I'm just recording the graffiti. So, and if you have any questions, of course, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I've got a blog, I've got an email. I'm happy to look at anything, just do send it over. And hopefully, have a little bit of background in graffiti, and hopefully you'll be interested in go out and look and find some on your own. So thank you guys for having me today.
Thank you, Crystal. Don't go to the churches right now, but if you ever find yourself in a church, check out the graffiti.